Welcome back, everybody. It's been a little while, but I wanted to continue on the kind of this sequence of EQ videos, and today we're going to be talking about a semi-parametric EQ. But before we get into that, I want to talk about what a parametric equalizer is. It's a term that we hear sometimes. Um, but I want to explain the concept because it's going to help us understand the circuit that we're going to be looking at here in a little bit. So here I have a plot of a one-band parametric EQ curve. This was actually pulled from the Audacity website. But the things to note here is that when we talk about parametric EQ, there are three parameters. So when it's parametric, it means that it is governed by parameters. So a parametric EQ is a resonant filter shape, meaning that it has a peak in it, and it is governed by three primary parameters. The first parameter is the center frequency, and that is what we see here on this plot is that the center of our notch is at 2 kilohertz because it was designed with a 2 kilohertz center frequency. So that is the point of maximum resonance of this particular EQ band. Okay, so we've got our frequency. So the next parameter is what's called our bandwidth. So our bandwidth defines how wide this notch is. And this bandwidth is also sometimes referred to as the filter's Q. Q stands for quality factor, or really just how tight it is. So when we have something that is a very narrow shape, so for example, if our filter were to come and look like this filter shape would have a very high Q, but a very small bandwidth. Okay? But if our filter instead were to be, say, really big and fat, and so it comes and does kind of this thing, then we would say it has a very low Q, but a very high bandwidth because it's a really wide filter. Okay? And then the third parameter that we have is the gain of the filter. You see here that they specify minus 20 dB gain. And that's because this right here is our unity gain level, is minus 30 dB FS in this case. And so you see that our peak is down here at minus 50. So what it's doing is it's notching out 2 kilohertz by 20 dB relative to it doing nothing. And then obviously we see that as we get away from the center frequency, the filter does less and less. But these three parameters, the center frequency, the width, and the gain, are the three parameters that make up a parametric EQ. So when you see a parametric EQ, it's always going to have three controls. It's going to have center frequency, width or Q, and gain. Okay? And sometimes this just says boost, cut, or level, or something like that. So that is a fully parametric EQ. However, today we're going to be looking at what's called a semi-parametric EQ. And when we are talking about a semi-parametric EQ, it means we only have control over a couple of the parameters. Specifically, we don't have control over the width of the filter. Rather, we have control of the center frequency and the gain. Okay? So a good example of this, both like Ibanez and Boss both have circuits like this. And the circuit that we're actually going to look at is a Boss circuit. It is the Boss PQ-4. And they call it a parametric EQ, but it's actually a semi-parametric EQ. And I'll show why that's the case here in a little bit. But first, here's the schematic. And there are just a couple of things to note here. First is that this path here has to do with the bypass path. So we're just going to completely ignore it. Okay? The other thing of note is just that the notation that they use here, this half black, half white triangle, is a bias voltage. Okay, so it's just important to note that that shows up around each of our op-amp stages and transistor stages. Okay, and that's for biasing the circuit so that it works on single supply. So let's go ahead and jump right into the signal path here. So we have our we have an input resistor off of our input, and then it goes through a cap and a pull down resistor. This isn't really a this isn't a DC pull down resistor. This is actually an AC pull down resistor because it's going to Vref. Okay, Vref is acting as our bias voltage, but it also acts as an AC signal ground. So we've got a little bit of a high pass filter here, very low corner frequency. It's just getting rid of like the really low frequency stuff. This 1 meg resistor is also acting as our resistor to the bias voltage so that we're biasing the gate of our JFET here. Okay, so that JFET here, we're tied directly to power on the drain, and the gate is, or no, sorry, not the gate, but the collector is tied to ground via a 10K resistor, and we're coming off of the collector. So this is a common collector amplifier, which is just a non-inverting unity gain buffer. Okay, so this whole section right here is our input buffer that has a very low corner frequency high pass filter right there. Okay, and once we go through that buffer, we then come down here, we go through a DC blocking cap, and then there is a 1 meg resistor to Vref here. This is going to provide our bias voltage onto the positive terminal of this op amp. And then we have a 10K input resistor to the plus, and then we have this arrangement of a potentiometer here. This is the level potentiometer. We have a 10K feedback resistor, a 1.5K resistor here, and a big electrolytic cap here. And what's happening is that this level potentiometer is basically just changing how much resistance there is through the feedback path, okay? Because it's going to change the effective resistance between here and this point, okay? And so that's going to change the gain of our non-inverting amplifier here, okay? So it's actually just a really super basic op-amp gain stage here. That gain stage gets followed up by another op-amp stage, but you'll see here we've got our really big DC blocking cap here, but then we have this parallel branch of a resistor and a capacitor and a resistor here prior to the inverting terminal of this op-amp, and then we've got that in our feedback network. So what this whole combination here does is it actually creates a very mild low pass filter. Okay, it's really in effect just boosting some of the very high frequencies, but just in a very mild way. And in fact, we're going to undo that boost in this op-amp stage here, but it gets done for the sake of all of the EQ that's going to happen down here. Okay, so you'll see that we've got this big old chunk of stuff here. These are the 4 frequency bands that we're dealing with. So the 4 in the PQ-4 is that you have 4 different frequency bands of control. You have presence, which is very high frequencies. You have high, middle, and low. And we're going to take a look at these in more detail here in a little bit, but I just want to finish off just kind of the rest of the audio path to output real quick. So we've got this op-amp stage here that kind of undoes the high frequency boost that happens here. And then we have a little bit, we have a DC blocking capacitor. This is a bias voltage here. It also acts as a very, very low frequency high pass filter. We then come up here and have an output buffer. Okay, this whole thing up here is just a unity gain output buffer with just a tiny bit of filtering that happens thanks to those RC networks there, but those are super low in frequency, mostly just getting rid of DC and near DC components. Okay, so now let's get to the meat of this, which is the EQ. Now, kind of like what was happening in our graphic EQ previously, is that the level control for each of these bands is really just controlling how much of this signal is on the how much of the signal is present on the negative input terminal or on the output terminal, because depending on what the balance of the signal is going to determine whether we are boosting, cutting, or doing nothing with our band. So for example, let's look at the presence band here, okay? So we take the output of this op-amp stage, and it is coming through an RC network here. This RC network is a high-pass filter that is set to about 7 kilohertz. It's like 7.2 kilohertz. And it's really easy to calculate that out. You just take, you know, your 1 over 2 times pi times your capacitance and your resistance, and you'll find that frequency. So we're only dealing with frequencies above about 7 kilohertz. Our transistor here has its collector tied directly to power, and we're coming off of the emitter, which means this is a common emitter amplifier, or it's just a unity gain buffer. So really what we're doing is we're rolling off the really high frequencies and we're buffering that signal. And then it comes into a potentiometer here, and this potentiometer is just telling the is just governing whether we're putting more of the signal here or here. Okay, and so we see that this is terminal 1, which means that this is when we turn it all the way down. So if we turn the presence all the way down, that means there's a short through here, which means that we are feeding a lot of this signal up into the inverting terminal, which means we are creating negative feedback from here to here. And when we create negative feedback, that's when we are reducing the signal there. Okay? So when we pull our slider all the way down or we turn our knob all the way down, we are sending our signal through a negative feedback loop to reduce the presence of that frequency content. Okay? However, if we were to now have our potentiometer go more towards this side, then we have a large resistance to come back to the negative input, but instead we're essentially taking this signal and we are filtering it, running it through here, and sending it into this inverting input here. And since we're not in the feedback loop of this inverting amplifier, we actually are boosting it. Okay? So if we were to look at the case where our potentiometer is exactly in the middle, that means we are sending the same amount of signal up here as we are to here, which means that essentially anything that's being done here is being exactly undone here, which means that our presence is flat. We're not doing anything there because the gain is canceling out. Okay? We're actually going to look at the low frequency stage because it's set up exactly the same way as our presence stage, except for the fact that we have now switched the relative positions of our cap and our resistor, meaning that this is now a low pass RC filter, and the values have changed because we want a different frequency. So our capacitor is much larger and our resistor is almost 2 times larger, which means that that cutoff frequency gets pulled way lower. In fact, with these values, the cutoff frequency of this RC filter is about 90 hertz. And we are just buffering that filtered signal, and it comes to the potentiometer where we can send it into essentially through negative feedback, or we can send it out through this forward path to boost it. Okay? So just those are the two bands at the outer edges that we don't have any control over the frequency of them, and we don't have any control over the Q. We only have control over the gain. Okay? If you wanted to put in controls for the frequencies, you could make R38 or R39. You could make those variable resistors, and that would change your cutoff frequency for those bands. And if you just wanted to change the fixed value where they are, you can change the capacitor and resistor values so that you are setting the bands where you want them. So for example, if you wanted to make this more suitable for like a drop tuned bass, maybe you want to change your frequency so that they all shift down a ways, and so you would increase the values of your components to bring those cutoff frequencies down. So the last big piece of this is the actual semi-parametric band, of which there are two here, and this is our semi-parametric band. This is one band here, and this is another band here. And the way that these work is that we are setting up, we've got 3 op-amp stages, and we are setting them up in such a way that we are we're buffering the signal here. Here, let me actually redraw that a little bit because I included a little too much there. So we're buffering the signal in kind of this part here, and then we create a filter here, and we create a filter here. Okay, and let's kind of explain what that means and walk through it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that too. So our signal from the output of this op-amp stage comes down here to what's marked A, and it comes through a 22 k ohm resistor, and there's a 22 k ohm resistor in the feedback path, meaning that this stage is unity gain. Okay, we have this R13 is tied to Vref, so this is providing the bias voltage on our non-inverting terminal, on our non-inverting terminal here. And so the output right here is going to be a buffered version of our input. Okay? But then what happens is this second op-amp stage, we have this. This is what we're going to focus on right here for now. So we have a variable resistor, which is 1/2 of our frequency pot. We have a small fixed resistance so that we never go to 0. And then we have a cap here. And if you remember, when we have an inverting op-amp stage like this, that's what this is. We have an inverting op-amp stage. The gain is set by the impedance of what's in the feedback loop versus the impedance on the input. Now, normally, we usually just talk about the ratio of the resistances, like we did over here. But when you put a capacitor or an inductor in the feedback loop, you have to look at the complex impedance. Okay? So instead of it just being the resistance here over the resistance here, it's actually the impedance here over the impedance here that is setting the response of this filter. Okay? And so what ends up happening is as we change the resistance coming in, it's interacting with the capacitance in our feedback loop, and it's creating a filter. Okay? And what we're doing in this loop, so let's just look at the next stage real quick. You'll see that we have an identical series resistance of our pot and our fixed resistance and an identical capacitor here. which means that we're creating a low pass and a high pass filter that are put in series. So if I were to take a signal and I were to put a high pass filter that looks like this, and then I were to put a low pass filter that looks like this, and I were to put them in series, you would get a resulting curve that does this, okay? These would extend off. So what we're doing is we're essentially creating a band pass filter by cascading a low and high pass filter. And that's exactly what's happening here. And the output of this stage here is being fed back into this negative terminal, and that is what creates our response like this, okay? And so at this point here, our output, we have a cascaded low pass filter and a cascaded high pass filter that is forming a band. Now, you remember that the center frequency is one of our parameters, and that is governed by these two resistances. So this is a dual gang pot, so that as one resistor goes up, the other goes up, and that's going to shift our frequency one way or the other. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense, because once we have those filters cascaded like that, then we simply take them down to a potentiometer that does the exact same thing that the presence and the low frequency does. Meaning, if we want to notch out the high frequency band, then we want this to be a short so that we go back up through the negative feedback loop of this op-amp stage here. But if we want to boost the signal instead, then we don't want any negative feedback. Instead, we want it to come up to the input of this op-amp stage. Okay? And so the gain, this gain control, is really just a ratio of, are we putting it in negative feedback or are we sending it forward? Because there's a fixed amount of boost that's going to happen. All right? And the middle band is identical to the high band, except that the capacitors and the op-amp feedback paths are different. And that changes where the corner frequencies are. So if we were to look at the high frequency band, these values allow us to go from roughly 1 kilohertz to something like 6 kilohertz. Okay? And with just changing this capacitor, our middle band now goes between 100 hertz and about 1 kilohertz. And our low band is about 90 hertz. Man, I'm so awesome at drawing with the mouse. And our presence is at about 7 kilohertz. Okay? This actually probably goes even a little higher. I didn't plot it all the way up, so this might be more like 8 kilohertz or something. Okay? But the point here is that each of these bands is set so that they can't really overlap. There can be like a tiny bit of overlap, but they're not meant to overlap very much. And that is what gives you the most control over a really wide bandwidth of your signal. If you were to try and just have one band that could cover like the entire audio band, you would end up needing some really large resistors, which could introduce more noise into your signal. Plus, you would only have one band. So we see that these bands are set up so that there's just a tiny bit of overlap, if any, in them. Okay? And so the fact that we can come in here and we can change the gain and the frequency of these middle two bands is what makes it semi-parametric. We don't have any control over the Q or the bandwidth of these filters. And the reason for that is because, if you recall, I said that a parametric EQ is a resonant circuit, right? That means that there's a point at which it hits maximum resonance and it dies off. But this pedal this circuit is not actually doing that. This circuit has no resonant elements in it. Rather, they are stacking a high pass filter and a low pass filter to approximate the same response. But because we're just using a high pass and low pass filter, we can't control the slope of these filters with the components that we have here available. Okay? Which means that we have no control over the width of this filter. That's going to stay fixed. And so this is our semi-parametric. This would be a fully parametric response. So there we are. We've taken a look at the audio signal path here. We have taken a look at how we are using essentially the feedback loop nature of an inverting op-amp gain stage to either boost or cut the frequencies that we want. And we have taken a look at how we can use buffered passive filters for the presence and the low frequency bands. And then we've taken a look at how we can cascade high and low pass filters together to approximate a parametric response for a couple of different frequency ranges. I hope that was helpful. If you want to be notified of when the next video is up, then go ahead and please subscribe. But until then, take care.